Ladies and gentlemen, the courtroom has never held its breath like this before. The judge's gavel echoed through a room heavy with tension. Outside, protesters clashed and news cameras rolled endlessly. Inside, the defendant, a former president, sat expressionless as the prosecution prepared to unveil a case the public had only heard whispers about. They called it the mother of all lawsuits, but no one was ready for the scope of what was about to unfold. When the lawsuit was first announced, many dismissed it as another politically charged battle destined to fizzle out in the media. But this wasn't just about politics. It was about money manipulation and the alleged systemic abuse of power hidden beneath the polished surface of a presidency. With over 19 plaintiffs, thousands of pages of sealed evidence, and a team of federal prosecutors unlike anything the country had seen before, this case was poised to do the unthinkable. Put Donald J. Trump in the direct line of the law, not as a leader, but as a defendant. Now, in a faceless courtroom shielded from the media frenzy, the most powerful man in recent American history faced the biggest legal reckoning of his life. The courtroom was so silent you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights above. The prosecutor stood at the center of the room, holding a thick binder labeled Confidential, Exhibit A. She took a deliberate breath and said, "Your Honor, members of the jury, what we are about to present is not just a lawsuit. This is an unraveling of deceit, corruption, and calculated manipulation at the highest level of leadership." Whispers began to swirl among reporters and legal analysts outside the courtroom. What had started as a murmur about financial misconduct had snowballed into a sprawling legal offensive implicating former President Donald J. Trump in what was now being described as the largest coordinated fraud operation tied to an American presidency. According to the lawsuit, Trump and his close associates had used political action committees, real estate ventures, and international shell corporations to allegedly launder hundreds of millions of dollars across at least 9 countries. The funds originated from both domestic political donors and undisclosed foreign sources. The money, prosecutors claimed, had not only funded lavish personal expenses and real estate acquisitions, but was also tied to influence peddling, shaping policy decisions for the benefit of foreign entities and private interests. The prosecution's first witness was a forensic accountant from the Department of Justice's elite financial crimes unit. Calmly, he walked the jury through a digital presentation that showed the flow of funds, crisp diagrams, email headers, encrypted wire transfer logs. One slide sent a wave of reaction through the room. A chain of transactions that began with campaign donations and ended in a bank account in the Cayman Islands under a pseudonym linked directly to a Trump-owned LLC. The defense immediately objected, calling it circumstantial and politically driven. But the judge, known for his stern impartiality, overruled. "Proceed," he said coldly. "Let the evidence speak louder than the opinions." What followed next stunned even the courtroom veterans. The second witness was a former White House staffer, now under federal protection, who testified that Trump had personally signed off on internal memos approving shadow transfers of funds to overseas lobbying groups disguised as charitable donations. Her voice trembled as she read aloud excerpts of one such memo. "Make sure the wires are scrubbed and the PAC files are clear. I don't want my fingerprints on this one." The defense again objected, claiming the document was fabricated. But the prosecution revealed it had been verified by 2 independent digital forensics experts and matched metadata from official government servers. As the evidence mounted, the lawsuit's nickname, the mother of all lawsuits, no longer seemed hyperbolic. More than 19 plaintiffs had joined the case. Former staffers, donors, watchdog groups, and 1 foreign government intelligence representative under a sealed agreement. The lawsuit alleged violations ranging from campaign finance fraud, money laundering, violation of the Foreign Agents Registration Act, FARA, to conspiracy to defraud the United States. And yet, what made the case truly historic was the scope of evidence. Over 11 terabytes of digital files, thousands of classified memos, hundreds of emails and phone recordings, and at least 5 cooperating witnesses who had worked directly in Trump's financial and political inner circles. The prosecution wasn't simply throwing accusations. They were building a case as methodical and explosive as a demolition crew preparing to bring down a skyscraper. Outside the courtroom, the public response was divided and explosive. Cable networks broadcasted live panels with former federal prosecutors analyzing every testimony. Protesters from both sides clashed outside the courthouse, and #the mother lawsuit trended worldwide. The air was charged, not just with politics, but with a sense that something monumental was unfolding. Inside, however, the mood was surgical. This was a trial, not a spectacle. And in that space, the former president of the United States sat quietly, flanked by his attorneys, unmoving as former allies turned against him and layers of financial secrecy began to peel away under the heat of legal scrutiny. The day closed with a final blow. The prosecution submitted an internal ledger labeled Project Eclipse, detailing off-book donations totaling over $240 million, tied to 17 foreign nationals, all funneled into a private investment vehicle linked back to Trump's personal trust. The room held its breath. Trump's lead attorney slammed his briefcase shut, whispered something in his client's ear, and requested an emergency recess. But it was too late. The door had opened, the lawsuit had landed, and the mother of all legal storms had just begun. The second day of proceedings began with a hushed tension that settled over the courtroom like a fog. There had been whispers overnight, rumors that someone from Trump's inner circle had flipped. The media speculated wildly, but few believed that any of his long-standing loyalists would turn on him. Not after years of surviving investigations, impeachments, and public scrutiny. But then the prosecution stood and called their next witness. Matthew Rylance, Trump's longtime chief financial advisor. The moment Rylance entered the courtroom, heads turned. Once dubbed the Iron Accountant, he had been a fixture beside Trump through campaign trails, transition teams, and high-level strategy meetings. Always silent, always loyal. Now he looked thinner, worn down, and alone, his eyes scanning the defense table briefly, not with hostility, but with something closer to regret. Under direct examination, Rylance confirmed what few thought possible, that he had been granted immunity in exchange for full cooperation with federal investigators. Audible gasps echoed across the gallery. Trump, for the first time, leaned forward, his jaw clenched. "Mr. Rylance," the lead prosecutor began calmly, "were you aware of the off-ledger accounts used to process international transfers from undisclosed donors?" "I wasn't just aware," Rylance replied, voice steady. "I helped create them, under direct orders." A document was presented, signed by Rylance and bearing Trump's electronic signature. It was a directive to establish what was internally known as the Clear River Fund, a so-called philanthropic shell that had moved over $60 million into a network of businesses tied to Trump's portfolio. Rylance explained how the fund had been structured to appear as charitable grants, but the money had been funneled into private real estate, luxury assets, and legal slush funds used to settle internal disputes before they reached the public eye. But the true bombshell came when Rylance was asked to detail the Wednesday meetings. "Every Wednesday at 7:30 p.m., we met in the residence," he said. "Only 4 people were ever present. Mr. Trump, myself, his chief strategist, and a legal advisor. Those meetings were never scheduled on paper. They were verbal only. We reviewed campaign finances, rerouted donor money, and discussed how to move funds without triggering FEC red flags." The courtroom went still. The judge looked up over his glasses. "Mr. Rylance," he said with a measured tone, "are you stating that the defendant knowingly directed the movement of funds in violation of federal election laws?" Rylance nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." Repeatedly. At this point, Trump's lead attorney stood. "Objection, Your Honor." These are uncorroborated claims from a disgruntled former employee seeking leniency for his own misconduct. But the prosecution was ready. Without missing a beat, they produced audio recordings. They were scratchy but clear, voices unmistakably recognizable. One was Trump, the other was Rylance. On the recording, Trump could be heard saying, "We'll spin it like a scholarship fund. Put the international ones under the Cayman branch. No one needs to know unless they get nosy. And by then, we'll already have the votes." The court erupted. The judge called for order. Trump turned to his attorney, visibly shaken. He whispered something unintelligible as the court security increased their presence around the room. Over the next 2 hours, Rylance walked the jury through internal memos, password-protected spreadsheets, burner phone records, and encrypted communications that showed a pattern of deception, cover-ups, and strategic manipulation. Some of the messages were deeply personal. Indications that Trump had been warned multiple times by legal advisors that certain actions were in clear violation of federal law. Yet he'd proceeded anyway. In one damning email, a now-deceased campaign strategist had written, "We are way past legal gray zones. If this ever sees light, we're not looking at fines, we're looking at indictments." That line was read aloud in court. The weight of it dropped like a stone. Outside the courtroom, commentators were stunned. "This is the turning point," one legal analyst said on a breaking news broadcast. "This isn't hearsay anymore. This is someone who lived inside the machine, and he's handing the government the blueprints." Inside, Trump's defense team looked fragmented. 2 of his lawyers requested a sidebar with the judge. There were murmurs of one attorney preparing to resign. Another was spotted leaving the building minutes after adjournment, refusing to speak to reporters. The media frenzy intensified, but inside the court, the atmosphere had changed. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a collapse in real time. And the man at the center of it all, the former president, sat with arms folded tightly, staring ahead. No outbursts, no remarks, only silence. The kind that often comes when even the most confident man realizes the fortress he built might just be crumbling beneath him. Court resumed the following Monday with the defense appearing slightly more organized, though visibly strained. A weekend of emergency meetings, media firestorms, and speculation had left both legal teams exhausted. But no one could have predicted what was about to happen next. Just as the prosecution prepared to call its next witness, a federal marshal entered the courtroom and handed a sealed envelope to the judge. He read it, frowned, then addressed the room. "The next witness has requested identity protection under federal security protocols. Their testimony will proceed under anonymity, with altered voice and facial shielding." The courtroom buzzed like a hive of confusion and alarm. Anonymous witnesses were rare, almost unheard of in a case of this magnitude. The defense objected immediately, arguing that such testimony could not be cross-examined fairly. But the judge was unshakable. "The integrity and safety of this witness has been evaluated and approved by the Justice Department. Their testimony is critical. We will proceed." Then the doors opened, and the witness entered. Clad in dark clothes, their face blurred in real time through high-level encryption technology, their voice digitally modified but clear. Witness X took the stand. The courtroom fell into an eerie silence. "My name, background, and identity are classified," they began. "I worked as a senior cybersecurity contractor within a data operations unit responsible for analyzing encrypted communications involving high-level government figures and private sector partners. What I'm about to share involves real-time surveillance data collected legally under a national security directive." Everyone, from the judge to the reporters seated behind the glass, was frozen. Witness X produced a 2-terabyte drive labeled CodeLock Zeta. The prosecution explained that this drive contained secure server logs, message traces, and internal communications that pointed to direct involvement by Trump in a covert digital operation designed to launder and obscure financial trails tied to foreign contributors. Mr. Trump's team utilized a decentralized network of encrypted channels hosted through international proxy servers, Witness X explained. These systems were designed to evade detection by domestic financial authorities. My task was to trace these links for a different case, but the data led me here. A screen lit up in the courtroom, displaying a timeline. Dots blinked across a global map: Zurich, Dubai, Seychelles, New York, Washington, D.C. Each dot represented a message. Each line connecting them was a digital fingerprint. And every one of them, Witness X testified, originated from accounts linked directly or indirectly to servers registered under Trump Organization subsidiaries. This isn't circumstantial metadata, they continued. These are full-text logs, audio transcriptions, and IP-level records of encrypted conversations, one of which includes Mr. Trump himself instructing a handler to, quote, "Move it through the shell. Make sure it doesn't ping on U.S. soil." Trump's attorney stood. "This is preposterous. Fabricated nonsense. Anyone can fake data logs." But the prosecution was ready. The data has been authenticated by 2 federal agencies, including a cybersecurity task force with oversight from the Department of Homeland Security. They replied. "It's real." The defense demanded cross-examination. The judge allowed it, but placed strict limits. Witness X answered each question methodically, never veering into personal opinion, sticking to the technical evidence. When asked if the witness could prove the origin of the data, they replied, "Yes, and I've submitted the encryption keys, timestamps, and server hashes for third-party validation." The prosecution played a clip, heavily redacted, of what sounded like a meeting between Trump and 2 unidentified individuals. A voice, unmistakably his, says, "We don't need to disclose that kind of gift. It's not a donation, it's appreciation. Clean it, move it, and don't let Treasury sniff it." Though the defense protested the authenticity of the voice, a biometric analysis had already been submitted. It showed a 92% voice print match to Trump, enough for the court to accept it as admissible under evidentiary standards. Outside, a storm of coverage exploded. Some networks called it the digital dagger, the turning point where technology finally caught up with the powerful. Others denounced the anonymous nature of the witness, claiming it set a dangerous precedent. Inside, however, the courtroom remained focused. The jurors took furious notes. One juror, seen earlier glancing skeptically at the prosecution, now sat frozen, jaw tight, pen gripped hard enough to bend. When Witness X finished, the prosecutor turned to the jury with final words. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a political spectacle. It's not theater. What you've seen here is the architecture of deception, exposed by a single brave voice armed only with truth and technology." The judge nodded and dismissed the court for the day. No one moved right away. It was as if the entire room had just witnessed something that transcended law. A glimpse into the hidden machinery behind the headlines, and the chilling ease with which systems can be manipulated by the powerful. As Witness X left through the security door, unseen and unnamed, a single truth remained. The walls around Trump's defense were no longer cracking, they were collapsing. By the 4th week of proceedings, the air inside the courtroom had shifted completely. What had begun with fiery denials and bold declarations from Trump's legal team had eroded into silence, side glances, and frantic scribbling. Outside, the world watched with breathless fascination. Inside, the defense was unraveling. And then, just when it seemed the prosecution had sealed every corner of the case, Trump's legal team pivoted. It started quietly, behind closed doors. Court documents revealed a sudden change in tone from the defense. A sealed motion was submitted to request a partial immunity deal for one of Trump's remaining advisors, suggesting the defense was attempting to shift responsibility to lower-ranking operatives. Then came the public shift. The next day in open court, Trump's lead attorney, James Ellison, stood and addressed the jury in a tone none had heard before. Gone was the dismissive bravado. In its place was a calm, calculated acknowledgement. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we are not here to argue that every decision made within a complex campaign operation was perfect. Mistakes were made. Bad actors may have exploited their positions. But we urge you to ask, did the defendant, Mr. Trump, knowingly orchestrate every layer of these alleged actions? Or was he surrounded by individuals who failed him, misled him, and acted in their own interest?" The courtroom stirred. Jurors looked at one another. The pivot was clear. Shift the narrative from guilt to plausible deniability. The prosecution objected, stating that such a defense contradicted earlier sworn testimony, claiming full innocence and knowledge. But the judge allowed the change in strategy, noting that defendants were entitled to adjust their defense as long as the facts were not misrepresented. Over the next 2 days, the defense paraded a new slate of witnesses, former interns, aides, and mid-level strategists, all painting a picture of chaos behind the scenes. They described a fractured team, overrun by opportunists, lobbyists, and digital operatives who allegedly kept key financial decisions insulated from Trump himself. "He was the brand," one witness said. "He gave the speeches, led the rallies, but the machinery underneath, that wasn't his domain. It was the advisors." But the prosecution was relentless. With surgical precision, they introduced email after email, video clips, and meeting memos contradicting the narrative of ignorance. One document, dated just 4 months before the 2020 election, bore Trump's signature next to a strategy memo titled "Donor Diversion and Targeted Advocacy Fund." Attached to the memo was a spreadsheet listing fund transfers to third-party groups tied to foreign lobbying interests. The defense scrambled. In a bold move to humanize their client, they introduced a pre-recorded deposition from Trump himself. He appeared seated in a high-backed leather chair, expression firm, tone subdued. "I didn't know every dollar, no. I trusted my people. If they did something wrong, they'll answer for it. But I never ordered anything illegal. That's not who I am," he said, leaning forward. "I'm a businessman, yes, but I'm not a criminal." But the deposition backfired. The prosecution paused the video at key moments, cross-referencing his statements with documented contradictions. In one part of the deposition, Trump claimed he had never authorized a transfer to any foreign account. Yet days earlier, Witness X had shown encrypted messages directly tying Trump to approvals for shell transactions routed through Zurich. When confronted, the defense stammered. Their entire strategy of distancing Trump from the evidence was slowly collapsing. Then came the moment that shattered their final hope. A surprise rebuttal witness, a former campaign compliance officer, took the stand unexpectedly. Tearful but composed, she revealed that she had resigned after being pressured to manipulate FEC filings to hide donor origins. "I sent a memo to Mr. Trump personally," she testified. "It said what we were doing was not just unethical, but illegal. I never got a response. But 2 days later, my access was revoked." She held up a printed copy of the memo, stamped read, 10:43 a.m., by Trump's internal email server. That was the turning point. Even the jury could no longer hide their reactions. One juror rubbed their temples. Another shook their head slowly. The defense's pivot had failed. Their attempt to turn Trump into a victim of rogue staffers had only opened the door to deeper scrutiny and more damning evidence. By the end of the day, the court was quiet. Not out of respect, but out of exhaustion. The defense rested with no further comment. Trump didn't speak. He sat with his hands folded, looking straight ahead, the screen still glowing with digital fingerprints and echoes of his own voice. There was nothing left to pivot to, no staffer to blame. No firewall strong enough. The next step would belong to the jury. And fate. The courtroom emptied with a solemn hush as the judge dismissed all parties for the day and gave final instructions to the jury. No one spoke as they filed out, their expressions unreadable. The prosecution had ended with an unforgiving barrage of evidence. The defense had tried, and failed, to reframe the narrative. Now, the weight of history rested in the hands of 12 ordinary citizens, locked away from the world in a secured room under 24-hour surveillance. The jury began what would become one of the most high-stakes deliberations in American legal history. Each juror had taken an oath. Each had sat through every hour, every witness, every piece of evidence, but nothing could have prepared them for the responsibility of determining the fate of a former U.S. president. The room itself was silent at first, no one wanting to speak. Then juror number 6, a retired accountant from Pennsylvania, broke the stillness. "I say we start with the documents. We verify the money trail. We walk backward." That simple sentence became the roadmap. They opened boxes of exhibits, spreadsheets, emails, audio logs, memos. One juror took the lead reading transcripts aloud. Another drew diagrams on a whiteboard, mapping the financial transactions from donors to offshore accounts. The mood was tense, focused, methodical. There were no politics in that room, only evidence and uncertainty. Juror number 11, a young schoolteacher, hesitated over the question that hung over everyone's head. But can we be sure he knew everything? Is that guilt beyond a reasonable doubt? It triggered the first real debate. Juror number 3, a former federal contractor, leaned forward. You don't need to micromanage a crime to be guilty of it. If he built the system, approved the plan, and silenced the whistleblowers, that's intent. That's control. They pulled up the audio clip of Trump's voice, the one where he'd said, "Clean it. Move it. Don't let Treasury sniff it." They listened to it 6 times. The room stayed silent afterward. Another juror, a grandmother from Iowa, teared up. "I voted for him," she whispered. "I believed in him. But that voice, that wasn't leadership. That was concealment." But unanimity was elusive. Juror number 2, a former Marine, stood firm. "We need to be sure. He might have been arrogant, manipulative. But criminal? This is the first time in U.S. history we're doing this. We better be damn sure." The group split, not on party lines, but on interpretation. Hours turned into a day. Then, too, they ordered takeout meals, scribbled timelines, challenged each other. Fights broke out. One juror threatened to walk. Another pleaded to return to key exhibits. Then came the breakthrough. Juror number 9, a quiet systems analyst, had been reviewing metadata from Witness X's digital logs. He discovered a timestamp that matched a moment from the deposition. A direct connection between Trump's denial and a verified message sent through an encrypted app. He circled the date. He said under oath he didn't send this, but the log proves he did. This isn't just misremembering. This is a lie, a calculated one. That was the turning point. One by one, the remaining holdouts began to fold. Doubt, once weaponized by the defense, was now a burden none could sustain. Juror number 2, the Marine, eventually leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and said simply, "I'm ready." They took a vote. 12 slips of paper. 12 answers. When the foreperson unfolded the last one and saw it match the rest, there was no cheer. No high fives. Only silence. The gravity of what they had just decided was larger than any of them could truly comprehend. They returned to the courtroom the next morning, faces grim, eyes heavy. The judge's verdict. A nation holds its breath. The courtroom was at capacity. Reporters from every major outlet sat shoulder to shoulder with silent tension. The judge entered, robed and composed, and called for order. Trump sat at the defense table, flanked by attorneys, motionless. The jury filed in. "Madam Foreperson," the judge said, "has the jury reached a unanimous verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." "Please stand and read the verdict aloud." The foreperson stood, her voice trembling slightly. "In the matter of United States versus Donald J. Trump, on the charge of conspiracy to commit campaign finance fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of willful violation of the Foreign Agents Registration Act, guilty. On the charge of money laundering through international shell entities, guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to defraud the United States government, guilty on all counts." The courtroom exploded into noise, gasps, cries, camera shutters snapping in rapid fire. Trump remained still. For once, the man known for bravado had no words. The judge raised his gavel and brought the room back under control. "Mr. Trump, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers on multiple felony charges. This court acknowledges your former service as President of the United States, but no citizen, regardless of title, stands above the law. The scale of deception presented here was vast. It was deliberate, and it threatened the foundational trust of this democracy." A pause. "It is the judgment of this court that you be remanded into federal custody pending sentencing. This court is adjourned." The gavel fell, and history was made.